and thanks for coming on this very bleak, cold morning. And who better to light it up for us than Karthik? So let me, I think Karthik needs no introduction here, and I'll just do the formalities anyways. So Karthik Muralidharan is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at University of California, San Diego. He's a PhD in economics from Harvard and from 2007, a research associate of NBER, fellow and board member of BRED, board member and co-chair of the education program at JPAL, an honorary advisor to Niti Aayog. We all know of Karthik's work, education, health, and more recently on social protection. He has, of course, numerous publications. Some of his recent ones are in QJE and AER, but I also should point out that some of his early work on teacher absence in other journals are extremely interesting, and so, you know, as he kind of builds up his profile, please don't ignore his earlier papers. They're very insightful. So Karthik is a, you know, since he's around today, I'd urge you to go and seek out. He's a very helpful guy. He's one of the few, you know, persons who does randomization, who you can actually go and talk about more descriptive work. And he's, so if you're interested in broad issues, broad trends, he's a very interesting person to talk to with interesting insights into these issues. So without further ado, now I'll leave the floor to Karthik. It's for an hour. I think the preferable format for is that he speaks, unless there are like really questions that have to be asked. Let's not ask them, given that there are people in other rooms. So he will go on for 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then we can ask him questions in the end. So Karthik, floor is all yours.
Is this on now? It's always a little scary when that happens before the talk. But so thank you. Thanks so much to the hosts at ISI, to Sudip, to Abhirup, Nishit, other members of the organizing committee. It's a great honor, great pleasure. And this is, this is a paper we've been working on for a very long time, and I'm excited to present that. It's joint work with Paul and Sandeep. And hang on, is there a particular angle that works with the camera? So there's no way to move that from there, is there? So it's kind of, I know, it's a little, but it's a little strange to see. I look at this and think, wait, that's mini-me. Okay, perfect. It's gone. Excellent. So anyway, so I think, you know, everyone knows. You
asked a question, you got the answer.
I got the answer. Okay. So basically, you know, everyone knows that public welfare programs are among the most common forms of anti-poverty programs in developing countries. There's a very long history. If you go down to Lucknow, the Bada Imam Bada is in fact a well-known case of a public works program. Jiska nahi maula, uska siraj-ud-dawla, right? Like, I mean, is the kind of public works program under which the Imam Bada was built. More recently, the EGS in Maharashtra, modern programs in India, Africa, around the world, and going back to Depression-era US, right? So various policy rationales, self-targeting, including through work requirements, public asset creation, creating more effective wage floor if the majority of your employment is informal, and if you can't enforce a minimum wage, that would be a goal. And I think, frankly, the most important political reason is that this may be more palatable to taxpayers than an unconditional dole. Okay, so people are more willing to support an anti-poverty program if there's a sense that people would work for this. And as with anything that India does that China does not do, it's the largest of its kind in the world, and is therefore important. Now, the amazing thing is, despite this, you know, importance of this program, we still don't really understand like these core questions about what are the impacts on income and poverty. And in particular, the major problem is that if the only thing that mattered were the direct impacts, you could just go measure in survey data and saying how many days of NRGS work did you get, how much work have you got, how much have you gotten paid, and that would be it. The problem is that this, you know, the program is almost certainly going to have broader labor market effects, and this could either amplify or attenuate the impacts. And in particular, I think the concerns of the Mark Rosenzweigs of the world has always been that this is going to increase factor misallocation, that the way you get growth is by increased urbanization, this is going to keep people in the farms, and that this is just kind of holding back the structural transformation, and that this is therefore cannot be a good idea. Okay, so, and this has just been like this big open question about, you know, these specific concerns of increasing factor misallocation as a result of this. Now, given the importance of the program, there's literally hundreds of papers that have tried to work in NRGS. You know, and the main problem is that the results to date are kind of all over the place. So my co-author Sandeep, who's written this review paper on NRGS, we kind of half-jokingly call it Suktankar's third law of NRGS, right? Which is for every paper that finds X, there's a paper that finds either no X or minus X. And part of the problem is not the papers themselves. The problem is just that the identification and data are, are limited. So you can either do the diff and diff, where you're using the staggered rollout. The problem then is that the parallel trends don't always work unless you control for a bunch of things. And so some people don't like that and prefer the RD. But if you use the RD, the bandwidth is usually too small for you to get significant effects. Okay, so and so that's kind of why you have these results kind of going in opposite places. I mean, personally, I think a bigger problem is not identification as much as construct validity, which is given the huge variation in implementation quality of NRGS, you don't know whether the difference in the results is reflecting differences in implementation or differences in identification because you don't see implementation quality on the ground. Okay, so in some sense, I keep telling people in the US, I'm really a public finance economist who works in developing countries. But the big difference in development is that in public finance, you can assume a policy is implemented the way it's written, whereas here we have this big implementation layer between design and implementation that could be large and quantitatively important. And then there's other identification issues that if these market level GE effects matter, then there's no reason to expect them not to spill over geographic boundaries. So the current identification happens through district level phase out. But if there are spillovers to control areas, then that's going to bias the effects downwards. And then there's limited data, which, even in the best days of NSSO data availability, we didn't have tick rounds around the time of the rollout, which has made it hard to have estimates on poverty. And the work to date has focused mainly on wages. Okay. So what are we doing in this paper? We're trying to make progress on each of these challenges by combining exogenous experimental variation. Okay, so this is one of the largest RCTs ever done, where we worked with the government of Andhra Pradesh to randomize the rollout of this new technology of biometric smart cards to make payments in the NRGS. Okay, so and this was randomized at scale at units of randomization that are large enough to capture GE effects. And I'm sorry. Okay, and then this is what we show in our prior paper, which I told Tridip to send along as homework. And so the prior paper is called Building State Capacity, and that's really much more of a paper of the impact of the technology on the program implementation. Okay, so what we see in the prior paper, so that's in the AER in 2016, is that this biometric smart cards improve the program function on every major metric. So the payment process improves, leakage goes down, there's more access to work, people perceive more access to work. So in every way, the smart cards brings NRGS on the ground closer to what the framers of the law intended to be, right? So in that sense, you could think about that as a first stage for this paper, because the smart cards are making NRGS work better, and then this paper is about the downstream effects of what happens when you get a better NRGS on the ground, okay? And the units of randomization are large enough to generate GE effects because we're randomizing entire sub-districts, so entire mandals of about 65,000 people, but because we have observed data at the village level, which is geocoded at the village level, you can then quantify the spillovers, because when you work with NSS, you're going to get district level data, but you're not going to get village level identifiers, so you can't actually estimate these spatial spillovers. And you get much more detailed data on outcomes of interest. So, and one of the results that will be important is our traditional measures of poverty based on consumption may miss it because households may interpret some of this as transitory and save it. So, but we have data on income, we have data on, so the one limitation in this paper, which I should flag at the very beginning, is that our survey data comes from the universe of job card holders. Okay, so we observe the 50% of the population that has the job cards, but we don't observe the landlords. Okay, so, and that's why we've spent so much time in this paper chasing up other census data sets, because that was not in we didn't have that survey data. Okay, so we've now gone and found 3 independent census data sets. The first is the SECC, that will give you income data. There's the livestock census, and now we have the economic census that gives us enterprises and employment. Okay, so all of that is going to come from the census. And then our survey data is going to give you much more details on income by source, on wages and employment and migration. Okay, so now, how should we interpret these effects? I think, like I said, obviously improving the program is not the same as rolling out the program. Okay, so one natural way of thinking about this is that there's an endogenous variable called effective NRGS, and that the smart cards is an instrument for that endogenous variable. Right? The problem is that, though, because NRGS is a multi-dimensional program, that it's best thought of as a reduced form impact of improving implementation on multiple dimensions. So, but from a perspective of rural poverty, you can think about this as a lower bound, because in this program there's no extra money being transferred, whereas if a new program is rolled out from scratch, you would actually get a fiscal transfer to rural areas as well. Okay, so basically we think that this is going to capture the effects on the labor market structure, but the actual effects could be even bigger. Right? So now there's a lot of results, and that's kind of why I wanted to go without interruption in the beginning, and also because there's people in other rooms. But the first and kind of most important, well, not most important, first and big headline result is that we find substantial increases in income and reduction in poverty from improving NRGS implementation. So let me highlight again, no additional money was spent. Okay, so there was some reduction in leakage, but no additional money was spent in the program. Okay, but we still find a substantial reduction increase in income and a reduction in poverty, about 12.7% increase in household income, 17.5% reduction in income poverty. And this is there both in the SECC, and so the SECC is ordinal, so we can't quantify the gains because it just has, are you in the bottom 5,000 or below, 5,000 to 10,000, 10,000 above, so it's only ordinal. So in the SECC, we see a reduction in the fraction of households in the lowest segment of about 5%. And then there's no effects on prices, so these are real effects and not nominal. Okay? I think the second, and in some ways most striking result, is that most of these income gains are not coming through NRGS. That most of these income gains are coming through gains in market labor income. Okay? So only 10% of this increased income is coming from more NRGS income. 90% of this is non-NRGS income. And out of that non-NRGS income, 80% of this is private sector earnings. So this is both agricultural labor and non-agricultural labor, which is mainly construction in this area. Okay, so so this is, in some ways, this whole paper is an accidental paper. So we initially started with the smart cards paper, wanting to have one table on incomes on smart cards. And then when we saw this, we were like, there's no way to make sense of this without thinking much, much harder about what's going on with rural labor markets. Okay, and so now what's driving this result? The first thing is this: we find robust evidence of increase in market wages. Okay, so now the wage and employment data we have are for June. The income data is for the whole year because NRGS peak months are May and June, right? So, and our surveys are done in July and August. So for the recall on wages and employment, we have that for June. Okay, but for the month of June, so there's two important results. The first is even the naive ITT effect, you get a 6.4 percentage point increase in wages. But then you get this additional spillover effect. So we find that there's spillover effects in wages in the sense that if you're a control block that is more exposed to treated neighbors, your wages also go up, and that's also significant. Okay, so and so in a way, these are two distinct ways of proving the GE effects, right? So the first way of showing the GE effect is that 90% of the income gains are from outside the program. The second way of showing the GE effect is that you're getting the wage effects in control areas that were not treated at all, which cannot happen if there aren't, in fact, these labor market spillovers, okay? So basically, and so, so in a way, this is like Kramer-Miguel on steroids, right? Because this is done at an economy-wide scale where you have these spillovers. So there in the Worms paper, they show the existence of spillovers, but don't adjust for the magnitudes. So you need to kind of do some adjustments, and this is what we get, and I'll talk more about that. I think the bigger surprise, and this is, I think, the single biggest shock for us in this whole paper, is that wages going up is still not as surprising. Okay, we have enough anecdotal evidence that better NRGS pushes up wages. The bigger surprise is that we find significant positive effects on employment. Okay, including market employment. Okay, so days idle fell by about 13%. And again, you can see this is a lean season, right? Because about 18 days out of the 30 days in June are in fact idle or unpaid. So people are not getting much work. But there's a reduction in about 2.5 days of idleness on that base. Private employment goes up by about 20%. This is 1.4 days on a base of about 7.1 days, and that difference is NRGS. So, and what's nice about this in terms of reinforcing our results is that the ITT and the spillover effects are again in the same direction. Okay, so you could think about this as two orthogonal sources of variation that are giving us the same results. And the reason is that the way we do the ITT effects is your own randomization status. The way we estimate the spillovers is we say, holding your own status constant, what fraction of your neighbors, excluding you, are treated, right? So that's in fact an orthogonal source of variation of the randomization status of your neighbors, and both of those give you exactly the same directional results, and that reinforces that the underlying result is likely to be true because this is coming from two different sources of variation. Okay, and in fact, migration, we see that the probability was slightly higher, though not significant. And this is not surprising now because we know there's kind of this U-shaped result with migration where, there's the price effect that keeps you on the farm, but then there's the income effect that allows you to pay the search cost of migrating, which we know is a big deal from, say, Mushfiq's work on bus tickets in Bangladesh, that having that income allows you to pay the search cost. Okay, so again, I don't have mechanisms, but it's not inconsistent with some of those stories. So now, this is where the paper was about 2 years ago, and we thought we had already done enough, but then, there's this, pesky breed of referee, it was like, wait, these effects are really big, but tell us more on mechanisms. And our initial reaction was that, the problem with GE is everything is changing, and I can't write down a fully blown out model without specifying the spatial structure of labor markets, which ends up being impossible to identify in this setting. So, but what we did was we then worked really hard to say, okay, let's focus not if you try to do GE of everything, you'll go nuts. So we're like, let's focus on labor market GE because that's where the core results are, and seeing that can we distinguish between labor supply and labor demand. So the basic result here is that wages went up and employment went up, and so there's two underlying mechanisms. One is labor demand could go up, in which case both wages and employment could go up together, or you could have a shift upwards in labor supply in the context of monopsony, which would also give you this result. Okay, so because that's your classic monopsony minimum wage result, that if there's market power, then you can push up an outside option and get an increase in employment, which again we forget, but that's kind of why trade unions, Thierry and I were talking about this. And so what we do is, this is kind of where we push the paper the most in the past 2 years, is so one nice thing here is existing work that shows market wages went up. You can't pin down labor supply or labor demand because you only see the outcome, okay? But here we also have reservation wages, and the reservation wage allows you to pin down that the supply in fact shifted up, okay? And you shouldn't think about this as a shift in the entire labor supply curve, but it's like a bending up, right? Because it's the outside option going up, okay? And we see a robust increase in the reservation wage. And we find evidence consistent with monopsony. So this is like a core new result, where what we do in the SECC is the SECC has data on land holdings for every single person, and you can use that to construct a Herfindahl of land concentration in the village, okay? And so what you see is two things in the data that are consistent with monopsony, that the private employment is negatively correlated with that measure of concentration, and the interaction of the concentration with the treatment is robustly positive, okay? Which is kind of your textbook test of monopsony, that do you get more increases in employment when there is more market concentration in a setting where you pushed up the outside wage. And so this is, and I'll come back to kind of how this has completely changed my priors, right? This is not something that I thought about ex ante at all. And what we, and this is probably a very weak measure of concentration because SECC doesn't give us Jati data, they haven't released that, so this is just at the individual parcel. And there's reasons to think that there would be more collusion at the Jati level, so this is probably a lower end, a lower estimate of the amount of collusion there is. And so in fact, consistent with Ashok Kotwal's AER paper on clientelism in Indian villages, right, so they have this quote there that local elites want to control NRGS to thwart implementation, right? So they actually say that, and saying that all of our facts are consistent with monopsony, though we have no direct evidence, okay? So if anything, there might be even more concentration than what we're picking up, but we see this even with this measure of Herfindahl. And conversely, in fact, initially my prior, and I remember talking to Som about this, right? You think this is an asset creation program, there should be some public assets, some productivity. But all of our calibrations show that that has to be second order, okay? So when we calculate the possible effect of increase in NRGS assets and total rural capital stock, it ends up being at most 1%. And that's because, remember, even if you depreciate all your capital over 10 years, right, like the marginal addition to the stock from NRGS across these 2 years cannot be as big a number. So we calculate the capital shares and show that this cannot account for more than 1%. We consistent with that, we go and check all the official data. There's no changes in NRGS projects, land under cultivation, irrigation, road construction, any of those asset numbers. There's no change in household consumption or prices. So if this was a demand effect, you should start seeing effects on consumption. We don't see any effects on consumption. And the wage increase is inconsistent with slack demand. So again, your classic demand constrained unemployment story, Dasgupta Ray style, would tell you that you would push up employment without pushing up wages, okay? And we see that increase in wages. So at least in the short term, we don't think the effects we're picking up is driven by demand. And what it looks like is that the households interpreted this increase in income as temporary and basically saved almost all of it. And so we see robust evidence in increase in household savings, investing, and higher credit uptake goes up, and we see increases in the two most important categories of assets, of both land and livestock. So land in some ways is zero sum, because if I get land, I'm buying it from someone else, but the livestock is not, and we see a significant increase in livestock, particularly buffaloes. And this is coming from the census, independent of us, and we kind of know that these buffaloes are an important asset. And again, explaining these effects is beyond the scope of this paper, okay, so we're just putting this as longer term effects. The paper is long enough and complex enough as it is, and then we have this economic census, which is again, just a mind-blowing result, and I have no idea except some theories on what could be going on. But this is conducted 1 year after the experiment, and in the treated areas, we see a 23% increase in the number of establishments and a 35% increase in employment in these establishments. So this is non-agricultural establishments, non-agricultural employment, okay? So, and again, this is consistent with 2 stories of potential structural transformation over time. Like, I mean, one is kind of a minimum wage big push. Jeremy Magruder has this paper kind of showing how, in fact, a broad-based demand increase, like, can then get you on a modernizing equilibrium, which is again consistent with no price effects, but you're seeing all of these effects in employment. The other is there's also the Hornbeck-Naidu AER paper on how when you have this increase in wages, you could get more mechanization, which could actually increase productivity. So all of this is beyond the scope of the paper. I'm just giving you that this is consistent with theories in development, and that's where that is. So that's a lot of results, and so in terms of how to think about all the contributions in the paper, I think the first is obviously just the effects of an employment guarantee scheme on income and poverty, where we think the advances we're making on the literature include identification. The first, I think, RCT that does this, and I'll come back and talk about why RCTs at the individual level don't really work. Including the spillovers, the first stage, because again, the first stage is a big deal, right? Because we know for a fact that there was more NRGS on the ground. So it's not like you look at the aggregate data and then have to ex post cut it up and saying, oh, these were better implementing states or not, right? Like, I mean, so this is direct independent evidence of first stage on the ground. We confirm existing results on wages, and then there's these key new results, the large increase in income, reduction in poverty, driven mainly by market earnings with a positive effect on private employment, which I think is key for policy. The other interesting point here is, so of course this contributes to the labor markets in developing countries, and I still think given how important this literature is, we have shockingly little work on actually, it's a structure of spot labor markets and labor markets in general. We're starting to see some resurgence in Supreet and Emily's work, but we're providing, I think, the first direct evidence of monopsony in rural labor markets. So in a way, this was not I've written this up more as a mechanism for the main result, but it's a nice example of how an RCT can actually go and teach you something either about theory or about the state of the world, which kind of reversed my priors of kind of competitive labor markets, right? And this is now consistent with evidence of monopsony in other settings, and what we're seeing, say, in work in the US now is that even in settings where you would expect much less market power, there's stickiness, which tends to give employers market power. So you shouldn't think about this as the classic single, coal factory, coal town, like there's one employer, but as long as there's enough stickiness and search costs, that gives employers power, and this is consistent with all of that. The other kind of main point I take away from this is the importance of credible public options. Okay, so people like Sujit Bhalla have argued for a long time that NRGS couldn't possibly be driving rural wages because it's only 4% of total employment. Okay, now of course that understates the importance, because in the lean season it's more like 20%. In the peaks over the year it's only 4%. In the lean season it's 4%. But still 20% doesn't seem that big, right? So Sujit would say, how can the tail wag this big dog that's the labor market? But the main point here is what matters is the credibility of the outside option. It's not the fraction that's accounted for, but how credible the outside option is, right? So, and that's kind of important and consistent with work in the US. So Clemens and Gottlieb have this JPE paper on how Medicare pricing moves 1-for-1 into private insurance reimbursement rates, even though Medicare is a relatively small part of the labor market. Paul Baudry has this Econometrica paper showing how when you change kind of industrial composition in a city, it's a Bartik instrument, so there's obviously identification issues, but the total effects on wages in that city level economy are about 5 times larger than what would be explained just by the share, the mechanical accounting share of saying how many workers in this industry that got this shock. Okay, so there's clearly these kind of outside options that affect bargaining that spill over into the broader economy. So when we think about public options, I think this is important to keep in mind. I think obviously there's kind of been criticisms about RCTs, and this would be a case where, in fact, if you randomized at the individual level, you would completely get the story wrong, right? I mean, you would totally miss the market effects. So it kind of highlights that the GE effects do matter, but on a more positive note, it shows that it's possible, like, to capture these effects, right? So Paul and Ted now have this nice paper combining micro and macro, where they've kind of helicopter dropped money in Kenya and villages and estimating fiscal multipliers through both randomizing at an aggregate level and tracking data in a very, very careful, comprehensive way. So again, it just highlights how experiments are kind of pushing the boundary on kind of standard criticisms. And I see that as just positive all around. And I think this speaks to kind of most of my research, and I see this in sector after sector, and this is what I talked about for the weekend, is just the centrality of governance and implementation capacity, right? So, and what we're seeing here is that the impact of improving implementation is as big as that of the program rollout itself, okay? And so in sector after sector, education and NRGS, I'm almost seeing this rule of 10 that says, it's 10 times more cost effective to improve implementation. And this is a really hard problem because the public, the activists, the media, they observe the top line of the allocation of money to a sector, but nobody observes the bottom line of what is actually reaching the beneficiaries, right? And for development economists, I think studying implementation quality, I think, is a first order topic in and of itself. So for those of you who are working on implementation, if you want to motivate that, oh, this just sounds like some, micro organization design kind of stuff, it's pretty darn first order, because essentially public finance and development is almost like saying this policy, and then there's this whole layer of implementation that's this black box where things leak along the way. Okay, so that's kind of that's the overall set of papers and contributions. How am I on time? Done. Okay, I have about half an hour. Okay. Okay, so basically, so everyone knows about NRGS. I don't need to go through what NRGS is. Smart cards, the aim was to reduce leakage, well-known implementation issues. So what did we do? There was this MOU with I was telling Thierry, right? The old state of AP is about 85 million people, which is bigger than, pick your favorite European country. It's bigger than France, it's bigger than Germany, it's bigger than, so it's a lot of people. But the nice thing about AP is that you have mundals instead of blocks, okay? So mundals are about a quarter the size of blocks, and so that allows you to randomize with enough statistical power and kind of get a lot of really neat results. So the average mundal has about 62 to 65,000 people, about 25 villages. Hang on, do I have a map here of the randomization? Yes, there's the map. Okay. It renders a little slowly. So this is the old unified state of Andhra Pradesh, and now we have external validity because we have results in 2 states, because this is now both Telangana and AP. And so in these 8 districts, as the government was rolling out the biometric smart cards, we basically kind of worked with them to say, listen, you're not going to have the administrative bandwidth to saturate the whole district in less than 2 or 3 years anyway. So instead of doing this arbitrarily, why don't we do this randomly? Okay, so we kind of worked with them to randomize the sequence, and there's so this treatment, and there's an interesting political economy lesson here, right? So when we teach experimental design, we normally teach that the optimal design has a larger control group because the cost per data point is higher in a treatment group, right? But when you're working with the government, it's the opposite political economy constraint, which is they don't want to hold back places. So like, what's the minimum number of places you can negotiate for them to hold back? And that's why the treatment group is much bigger than the control. And then we kind of did a 3-phase randomization where we had these buffers, and the reason we had the buffers was our biggest fear in our discussion with the government was that they would rush to cover the controls before we completed our surveys. So we were like, okay, here's this buffer. When you're done, you please go do your stuff in the buffer, but please leave the controls alone, till we finish this, okay? So that's why you have those buffers, and you can already start seeing how these spillovers are going to work, right? So here, for example, is a control guy surrounded by no treatments compared to, say, a control guy here who's completely surrounded by treatments. Okay, so that's the sense in which this is like Kramer-Miguel on steroids, right? They have exactly that same, this is by chance, and so it's orthogonal to the main randomization as to what fraction of your neighbors are treated, okay? So what we see in the first paper is you get this robust increase in every measure of NRGS. Payment process gets faster, less time consuming, more predictable. So all of that is fine, and I'm not going to repeat that. Okay, now the main concern is actually the exclusion restriction, right? So could the smart cards have affected the economy through things other than NRGS, right? Because what we're estimating is really the smart card program. And so it turns out that basically, luckily for us, unluckily for people, like, this program was only done by the Rural Development Department, like in 2 programs, in NRGS and Pension. So this was not like Aadhaar, that was a general purpose ID. This was offline authentication done by Rural Development for just these 2 programs. And what we'll show is that the pension, the entire effects are driven by the market gains, and the pensioners are typically too old to work. They're widows, disabled, and we're not seeing any effects on the pensioners. So that's not a concern. The second concern may be financial inclusion, that because the smart cards are also creating bank accounts, like, could this have had any effects on the economy? And again, fortunately for us, unfortunately for the poor, what happened was that the government was mainly focused on implementing NRGS laws of getting the money out to people. So they forced the banks to disperse all the money. So only 0.3% of households reported any positive balances on these cards. And also because it's offline authentication, you can only use it with that local POS guy in your village. So the only way this could be financial inclusion is if you were saving, but you weren't saving. And so basically that channel kind of doesn't apply over here. Okay. So then this is just showing you that, there's no change in fiscal outlay. All right, so so there's a lot of data. There's our own survey, which, like I said, the main limitation is that it's limited to the universe of job card holders. Now, this is non-trivial, right? This is half the population. It's not, and in some ways it is the core population we care about, because that's who NRGS was meant to serve. So the concern has always been, does the increase in wages crowd out private employment and therefore hurt the people who you're trying to help? Okay, so in that sense, the core population is this guy. But of course, you may worry that maybe landlords are so worse off, like, that this program is still net negative, and that's why we have all the census. So the positive results in the censuses should assure you that the overall effects are positive, but the survey results could include an element of redistribution, which I'm not capturing, right? Like, so think about the census as showing that the overall economic effect is positive. Think about the survey as showing that the effects on the poor were massively positive, but some of that could include redistribution from the rich, which I'm not capturing. Okay, so that's basically how you should think about all of this. Then there's the livestock census. The NSS we only use for prices because the overlap in sample is very small. We use the district handbook data for all of this other effects on assets and productivity and economic census. Okay. So just to give you a sense of the different recall periods of different data sets. So the income comes from a 1-year recall. The wages, employment, and everything comes from June recall. And then there's a bunch of other things on consumption. There's 1 month recall, and then there's other data sets. Okay? So this is pretty straightforward. Like, the ITT is pretty straightforward. Okay. But now one thing is, this is a village level panel, not a household level panel. And that's because there's enormous instability in which household works in NRGS, even from week to week. So if you did a household level panel, then you would be massively underpowered in terms of measuring impacts on NRGS or leakage, because the same household there's no likelihood that they're working in that spell 2 years down the line. Okay, so you end up having a village level panel that you kind of sample from a representative frame of job card holders, but weighted towards those who have worked in the past month, okay, or in that period. Okay. So then this is the map again. So when we go back to spillovers, I've already mentioned this picture, but I put this out there just so that you can get a sense of how these spillovers are going to matter. So here's, I think, a simple way of thinking about the spillovers, is that imagine that there's 2 distinct components of the treatment, which is your own bundle treated and what fraction of your neighbors are treated, right? Like, and both of these are going to matter. And you can basically think about the control is here, where you are not treated and none of your neighbors are treated. This guy is the treatment effect of your own bundle, and then this is the effect of having a larger fraction of your neighbors treated, right? So the total treatment effect is going to be this big guy when you go from you not treated, nobody around you treated, to everybody treated. Right? Now the experiment, as you can see, the ITT is estimating some hybrid here, right? Like, because it's going to be you treated plus the mean difference in neighbors treated, and that's kind of not an easy parameter to estimate. And so what we do is, in the interest of transparency, we first just do the ITT, but then what we show is we test for the existence of spillovers, and if they exist, then we correct for these spillovers, which is going to be this guy, and then report this adjusted treatment effect. Now, from the equations, we're going to estimate both beta t and beta n, so you can extrapolate and calculate this. We don't focus on this because that's an extrapolation beyond the coverage in the experiment, right? So we have to do this adjustment because that's biasing our effect downwards. The other extrapolation we leave to you if you want to do. okay? But mainly I'm going to focus on the ITT, which is the straight experimental effect, and the adjusted treatment effect, which is accounting for these spillovers into the controls. Okay, so yeah, so this naive ITT estimator will misestimate this. So first we test for existence, next we estimate the amount of spillovers, so that's exactly what I just said. Okay, so there's a subtle kind of econometric point here about how you define the spillovers, because essentially you could think about the spillovers as kind of around where you are, okay? The problem then is that that's actually not completely exogenous, because that depends on the distance from the border, okay? So if you're closer to the center, you're mechanically more likely to be surrounded by your own treatment status, okay? So the cleanest way to partition this is to say that there's your own Mundell's treatment status, and then for spillovers we look at everybody excluding you. So then that set is completely partitionable and orthogonal, okay? So that's how we present this. All right, so let's get to results. So this is from the SECC census, and this is what I said. You see a significant reduction in the households in the lowest bracket that's below 5,000, and this is again a large number of observations, so it's adequately powered. So a reduction here, an increase here, an increase here, you do this as an ordered logit, then of course the whole thing shifts out here, okay? But this is of course only ordinal, so then we go to the survey data. And then this is the big result of the survey data, that you get this 12.7% increase in income, in overall income. But notice that only 10% of this is NRGS income. Now there's a slight kind of, careful observers would notice that NRGS increase was significant in the smart cards paper, but not in this paper. And here the p-value is like 0.12. And what happens is in the smart cards paper, we're using the 7 weeks of peak NRGS with job card based recall of week by week, spell by spell. So that's much more precise. This is annual data based on annual recall. So the point estimates are identical. This is just slightly noisier, okay? This p-value is like 0.12. But then the big result is these guys, okay? So that you see these increases in ag labor, which is highly significant, and other labor. And these two guys together account for about 80% of the non-NRGS increase. Okay? And so that's where the action is. The action is in private labor income. Okay? And this is first order stochastic dominant, and then you can see that this is, you quantify the reduction in poverty. This is just showing you that there's no impact on the pension households, right? It basically offsets, so it's not driven by that. All right, so now let's go to the labor market, where this is now just simple ITT. So even without the spillover adjustments, we see a significant increase in wages and reservation wages, a reduction in days unpaid, which is about split equally between NREGS and private sector work. And by the way, so now some of this is also just a function of the data, right? So when Clement, Imbert, and Papp, when they show this reduction in private employment, it's partly because NSS counts like self-employment also as private employment, right? So whereas what you really care about is market employment. So if you include the self-employment, then mechanically you're going to get a reduction if you're spending more days in NREGS. So that's almost like an by construction. So what you want is market employment, right? Like, which is what, and again, that's not anything they can do about it, it's just how the NSS calculates it. Okay, so then this is the spillover stuff. So what we're doing here is first testing for the existence of the spillovers, and notice that there can be spillovers both in the control and in the treatment, right? I can be a treatment Mundell surrounded by more treatment guys, and the effects could be bigger, right? So this is just showing you simply regressing what happens to wages if you're a control Mundell as a function of what fraction of your neighbors are treated. And we do robustness at different radii, like, and it's always there. We pick 20, which is kind of seems, yeah, it's robust to everything. We pick 20. I think the climate literature uses that. Supreet says that's about the distance of biking, right? Like, so, but it's robust to all of that. Okay, we just pick one number. But what you'll notice is that these spillovers, they're there in both the treatment and control, and we never reject equality across slopes. Like, so we just use the pooled estimator. And now you see that there's positive effects on employment in the private sector, positive effects on wages. So then when you want to put this all together, this is what we do. We partition this and saying your own treatment status and what fraction of your neighbors, excluding yourself, are treated, right? So that's why this is a saturated set, okay? And this is own treatment, this is neighbors treatment, okay? And so now what you see is we can estimate the beta t and the beta n, all right? And this is the naive ITT. Now to calculate the spillover in the control, we take the beta n and then multiply by the mean exposure in the control area. So the mean exposure to treatment in the control area is 0.45. You multiply that by the beta t to calculate how much average spillover there is in the control area, which is how much you're understating your effects, and then you adjust upwards for that. Now there's one more really interesting result here, which I'll talk about more later, but what you notice is that there's no spillover in the reservation wage, but there is a big spillover in the market wage. Okay, and so that's consistent with the fact that my reservation wage responds to whether I have NRGS in my village as a more credible outside option. But it's not like I'm bargaining for a better wage. It's just like I don't need to show up because I don't need to show up in the private market because I have this other option. So the market wage has to respond to how many people in that area are withdrawing labor supply. The reservation wage only depends on, do I have a better option in my village? So that's not affected by whether there's NRGS happening somewhere else. Okay, so I find that quite interesting. And then coming to employment, again, you see that the spillovers, everything is in the same direction as the ITT, right? Like, I mean, and again, not accounting for the spillovers would bias these effects downwards, and once you do that, is when you get all of these positive significant effects on both market and NRGS employment. Okay. So then this is another really interesting result because in retrospect, if we had done this from scratch, I would have gone and collected wage data and employment data every month of the year, right? We only have this in June. Now, what we have for the other months is one data point per village where we ask kind of village elder or the sarpanch, what is the going rate for private labor month by month in the year, okay? So it's underpowered and it's noisy, but it does suggest that there's persistence in the effects. And consistent with kind of the peak effects being in the NRGS season, and that goes down. Okay, so this is consistent both with kind of nominal wage rigidity of the kinds of finds, but it's also consistent with this old labor tying literature, right? That kind of the landlords give you insurance in the lean season and extract that as a lower wage in the peak season. And so if they're no longer providing the insurance in the lean season, the ability to extract in the peak season goes down. Now, in practice, the landlords are not wage discriminating because it's kind of it's a standard wage, but the way this happens is they'll give you credit, like I mean in the lean season, and then extract the interest, like I mean in the wage that they pay, so we know that that also happens, right? So again, this is just throwing up avenues for future work for people who can then go look at each of these topics in more detail. I'm just saying that this is consistent with what we know from classic papers in development. Migration, there's nothing much. Prices, there's nothing much. Okay, so I have 8 minutes. So I'm going to go through this fast. Okay, so now let's go look at where can this be coming from? And this can either be labor supply and market structure, right? So I've already talked about this, that there's strong evidence that the reservation wage went up. And this is what I just said. The spillovers in reservation wages are not significant, while spillovers in market wages are significant. Now, in a neoclassical world, this increased labor supply would increase wages and decrease employment. Okay? And I remember when Alan Manning, we had a series of minimum wage seminars at UCSD about 6 years ago, and Alan Manning was presenting some stuff. And I asked this completely naive question, right, saying, why would we ever think that a minimum wage would not reduce employment, right? And he reminded me of what I'd learned and forgotten from high school economics, which I only learned because I had a British labor economist who remembered his monopsony and taught that to us, right? Like, I mean, that when you have market power, you can, in fact, have an increase in employment. Okay, so this is your basic classic monopsony picture, right? Which is when employers have market power, right? The marginal cost of labor is higher than the average, than labor supply. So which means that the employer maximizes profits by rationing employment, holding wages down here and capturing that as the surplus. And so what happens here, when you have an exogenous increase in the outside option, you could get an increase in employment when this wage goes up. Okay, so that's kind of Monopsony 101, which has kind of vanished from our intro textbooks for the most part. Okay, so, and then what we do is we're taking the SECC, constructing this Herfindahl, and then we do this two ways, both kind of using all the land holdings and excluding those below 1 acre because they are not likely to be employers. Okay, so we show both of that. And basically what you see is, look at this guy. Okay, so that's the key figure, right? Which is that the days worked in the private sector is negatively correlated with the measure of concentration, and the interaction with the treatment is robustly positive. And this is true both in the full sample and when you restrict it to above 1 acre. Okay, so that's kind of the key result, suggesting that there was uncompetitive markets. Now, there is one slight potential wrinkle here, which is we observe the SECC after the treatment. So if the treatment itself changed land concentration, so we test that that did not happen. But in case you're worried about that, we also standardize the land concentration separately within treatment and within control. So even if there's some level effect, you can just look at where in the distribution you are. And this is a broader point for people working in experiments when you want to look at heterogeneity of results as a function of things that may have moved after treatment. As long as you assume some kind of rank preservation, you can still look at this by normalizing within the control and within the treatment. And so what this is showing is just moving one standard deviation up in the concentration distribution would kind of reduce market employment in the correlation by so much, and the treatment kind of offsets that. Okay, so that's the monopsony result. Then labor demand, I've kind of talked through most of this. We see no increase in the number and composition of projects at land sown, area irrigated, and we have a calibration that shows this could be at most 1%. Now, and this is why sometimes, disciplining this with numbers is important, right? Because the earlier version of the paper, we were just like, the nature of GE is everything is going on, we can't rule things out. But when we were thinking about differences in MPC. So you could say that even if there was no extra money, if you're moving money from corrupt landlord or middlemen to the poor, maybe the differences in MPCs would give you some consumption and demand side effect. But that turns out to be just too small, right? Because the direct increase in NRGS income is only 1.3% of the total income. So even if the difference in MPC was 100%, that simply could not be driving the scale of the results. And we also see just no evidence of increase in consumption. So everything suggests that in the life of the survey, in the 2 years, the households interpreted this as temporary, right? And saved most of this and invested it. So, and that also tells you if you only relied on consumption as a measure of poverty, you might miss part of the story, that you have to kind of look at income as well. No increase in prices that would transmit to increased labor demand. And I've, again, talked about all this. So again, so I don't want to say that there's no effect of demand at all, right? Of course, you could have small increases in demand, and that could be playing a multiplier role in all of this, but there's no direct smoking gun evidence of significant demand channels. So if you take the upper ends of the confidence intervals for each of these things, it could still be in the range of 15-20%, but the point estimates are all pretty close to zero. Okay, okay, I have what, 4 minutes? Yeah. All right, so I think I'm almost done actually. So, and then there's these longer term effects where you see increase in credit. Again, informal loans, nothing informal. Survey data, so let me just show you the tables, okay? Let me just go straight here. So this is the increase in credit, right? And increase in land ownership. Increase in savings is not significant, but these guys are all highly so. And then what are they doing with this? They're significantly buying more buffaloes, okay, and this is kind of the wall test of joint significance, also significant, but the buffaloes is where the action is, which again, as Mark and others have taught us, is the highest return asset that requires upfront capital cost, and so you kind of see these big increases in buffaloes. Okay. And then this is the economic survey, right? So we keep on kind of trying to break down our results by going and looking at new data sets, and it just keeps showing up, right? So we had nothing to do with this. This is the economic survey, right? This is, all of these censuses are collected completely independent of us, right? The SECC is independent of us, the livestock census, and this is now the economic census of non-agricultural establishments and employment, and you're seeing this significant increase in the number of enterprises, and this is non-agricultural, right? And you're also seeing this increase in employees. So this is about a 35% increase, but remember it's off a very low base, right? So for the employment in non-agricultural enterprises is about 15%, so it's about a 6 percentage point increase on a base of about 16 to 18%. And then, so how do you interpret these longer term results? Right, so studying this is clearly beyond the scope of the paper. This has already become like about a 90-page behemoth, right? But at some point I'll be happy to work with a macroeconomist, because then you can calibrate and don't worry about standard errors, right? And take and just take our point estimates and just say something about decomposing these effects, in ways that might say something more, right? It's just that I don't have enough power to say anything significant about these things, okay? But the evidence is consistent with ideas of structural transformation in low-income settings with an exogenous wage increase. So Jeremy Magruder has this paper in Indonesia showing that this kind of, you could have this classic Murphy-Schleifer-Vishny type middle class matters, that you get an increase in wages, and that helps industry coordinate on a more modernizing equilibrium. There's also a variant of this that suggests that most enterprises in developing countries are demand constrained, right? And so that's kind of what you're seeing. And this is also consistent with higher wages inducing higher productivity mechanization. And so this is an important area for future work, right? So well beyond the scope of what we can do here. But again, since students need problems to work on, right? Like, I mean, this would be something good. So I think overall the evidence I see is, and let me put on record how much this has changed my priors, right? Like, I mean, this has completely blown my mind, okay? So, because I am on the record about 6 years ago at LSC, when we had the smart card results finding improved implementation, I actually said this may be a tactical win on a strategic mistake, okay? That this could be a bad policy that is now being implemented better, okay? So this has completely overturned my priors, and what the results seem consistent with is that an improvement NRGS increases the outside option, makes in the lean season, makes this more viable. And again, we know from SEMA's work, right? Like, I mean, when people are close to subsistence, like, you get this massive pressure, right, that pushes the wages down. So even the small effect on outside options can then push up the reservation wage, which has pushed up the market wage. And then this is the key new result, right? Meaning that this increase in employment, which we think is partly because I think we're measuring employment the right way, which the NSS includes self-employment, which really shouldn't be in here, and the fact that we've got the spillover adjustments, because the downward bias in the spillovers would kind of push you towards not finding the effect, and then that this increase in income is mainly being saved in the short term, right, like, I mean, and crowding in borrowing for more productive assets and getting you an increase in longer term economic activity, okay? So, yeah, so to conclude, I think, the policy implications, one way to think about this is through kind of employment guarantee versus kind of UBI type of debate. Now, Paul, is particularly a big fan of unconditional transfers, and I'm also a believer in cash transfers as a part of a component, a portfolio of anti-poverty strategies. But, this has significantly switched my priors. So, and let me also say on record, like, a couple of things about, given the Nobel Prize for experiments and all of this stuff, is to me this is like a classic, it's just been a great case of how experiments have expanded the range of problems we can take on, like, I mean, getting at GE effects, getting at theory, getting at mechanisms. But there's a deeper point, right, which is that the experiment forces you to revisit your theory if it doesn't accord with your priors, right? So, the fact that we cannot question the results means that we have to go back and question our assumptions, and that's what's gotten us pushing all of this way. So I presented this at UCL a couple of months ago, and Attila Lindner, who's written a bunch of these minimum wage papers, so he mentioned to me how he saw some data in Hungary where a similar kind of public employment program seemed to have increased employment, and he's like, nah, it cannot be true, so he didn't even bother looking at it, right? So it must be some confounded omitted variable, right? Like, it cannot be true. So the fact, when you have the experiment, you have to deal with it, right? Like, because you can't question this on the basis of identification. And so, it's been quite an interesting journey for us as we go through this paper. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, wow, you kept on time. That's great. That's the first, Karthik.
That's why I knew if there were no interruptions, I could stay on time. So
I was waiting for someone to ask, and Karthik saying, I've thought about it. Wait, give me some time. Anyway, so we have 2 more rooms. So let's start with the rooms, and we'll come back to this room because it's easier. Huh? So we don't have. Okay, so really a bleak morning. So then let's see some hands, and so okay. So let's start with theory.
Yeah, I remember a long time ago when I came to India, 30 years ago. My book in my pocket was a book by Pranam Bardhan on labor markets in rural economies, and there was something about interlinked rural markets, and where credit markets were interlinked with labor markets. So I was asking you whether actually you could actually identify, do you have this kind of causality running from employment and assets increasing, but could be the other way, that actually because you had these wage effects and maybe changes in asset accumulation by households, actually that could actually generate as well in these interlinkages some multiplier effect that your experiment could perhaps identify.
Oops, sorry. Absolutely, and I think See, to be honest, when we first wrote up the first drafts of the paper, I mean, we almost thought that these interlinkages were going to be so pervasive that it was hopeless, right, to try and say anything about mechanisms, right, because everything affects everything. There's interactions, there's feedbacks, there's multipliers. And so that's why we said, listen, this is just the best reduced form net effect of improving NRGS on the overall rural economy, right? But I think since we were pushed so hard to think about mechanisms, we were like, let's narrow this down to the labor market GE, because that's kind of the first order effect, that this is an employment program, public employment, how does it affect private employment? So we have the results now showing that there is this evidence of monopsony, which I think helps make a big part of this puzzle. Now in the longer term, we have only one experiment, so we're not identifying these other margins, right? So we can't rule out those stories, that there could be some overall feedback effect that's reflecting some of these effects.
Deborah.
Yeah, so like you, my mind was also blown by these results. I think it's fascinating, and I wouldn't have expected. So I was thinking, as you were speaking, I was thinking about this old monopsony thing. I had Abhijit's father teaching me about monopsony. But anyway, there are a couple of implications of that. One is that if you draw that, what you're doing is you're flattening out the marginal cost, right? So when you have a reservation wage. But one implication of this is that the wage rate, the private wage rate, should roughly now be in line with the reservation wage. Right, because once you go significantly above the reservation wage, you're following the old labor supply curve, and that would be a contradiction, right? So an indirect test of the monopsony argument is that the reservation wage and the market wage should coincide. Now, in treated areas, this should roughly be the same as the NREGA wage, right? The reservation wage, let's say I know it's 100 days limit, but it should roughly be that. The second piece of evidence is that if you look at farm income, for people who hire in labor, there should be a significant decline in farm income. And the third comment that I had on this was that you have this huge effect on other enterprises, as you said, going up by 35%, whatever the number was. That has to be a demand effect. Now, if that's a big demand effect, how come you're ruling out demand effects elsewhere?
Yeah, so all great questions. So let me start with the last one, right? So I think the last one, what I should clarify is the economic census results are from about 18 months after the experiment. Right? So it's not during the life of our survey data. So the way we think what's going on is that in the short term, people think this is temporary and save it. And then over time you see, wait, this is real, and then there has to be demand. So that's absolutely right. It's just that our survey data is within the 18 months of the experiment, and the economic census is 18 months after that. So, and that you should interpret as the downstream effect of this treatment. So that I think is on that one. I think the second one on kind of the effects on wages, on the market and reservation wages. So we've looked at all of this. There's two problems. One is that, in fact, if you look at the minimum wage literature, a lot of us, in fact, we think that there should be some bunching, like at where the thing is. It turns out that that's not true, because it actually moves all the way down, because employers end up needing to offer a little bit more to get the guy they were getting earlier, because you still need to offer a higher wage to get the higher productivity guy who is now bunched. So the existing minimum wage literature shows that you end up with a bigger distribution out. So we are not seeing any bunching of meaningful. And I think the other problem with this is that this is where these spillovers start getting really messy in terms of, because we're not identifying these spillovers, we have to make these functional form assumptions, and so within each of these villages, there's not enough power, right, to distinguish that stuff. So we've tried to look more at the distribution of the wage effects to see if we can infer a little bit more, and we're not able to because we're just underpowered for that. And the first point was on farm income, yes. So, and that's absolutely right, and sorry, that was the second point. And in fact, that's a caveat which we don't have, right? Because our survey data is from the universe of NRGS job card holders. So it's the bottom 50% of the distribution. And so that's why we've spent so much time chasing census data. Because if I gave you only the survey results, this could just be completely offset by reduction in farm income. So now the census data assures me that the overall economic effect is positive, but there could still be redistribution, right? So my survey effects could be bigger than the overall effects, partly because there's redistribution, but the census tells you that the overall effect is positive. Yeah. So I wish I had that landlord farm income data, which we do.
So we'll take the question there, Gaurav, Subhashish, and then so.
Just want to get back to the point about, trying to disentangle
demand, labor demand versus labor supply effects. And so two comments. One is that, your experiment involves, you're looking at the improvement. So it's not clear from that you can actually make an inference about the program itself, where the demand effect of the program itself, you can make an inference about that. So that's one issue. The other is that, it seems to me that, the fact that wages are increasing and employment is increasing is also consistent with the demand side story. The way you seem to be ruling out the demand side story seems to be that you're not finding an effect on income and consumption. Or
there's nothing, there's four ways in which we look at demand in the short term, right? So there is one side of demand which is saying that I have constructed more NRGS assets, and so that's increasing productivity. So that's the productivity channel, which we rule out by calculating the capital stock. Then there's kind of the consumption effect, that did you just consume this in great demand? We're not seeing effects on consumption. Then we're not seeing effects on prices. So all of this suggests that at least in this 18-month period, there wasn't stuff. But in the longer term, absolutely, the demand has to be a big part of
If I
it.
can follow up, but there's a direct, it's not just a demand effect through increased income, but there's a direct kind of labor demand effect. The EGS is actually increasing labor demand, overall labor demand. So it wasn't clear to me how you're ruling that out.
Yeah, sorry, I think I should be clear that when I say labor supply versus labor demand, the effect I'm trying to get at, see, the EGS mechanism, right, would basically give you an increase in wage and a reduction in private employment, right? So what I'm trying to focus on is what is the mechanism under which an increase in wage can get you an increase in private employment. So that's the sense in which I'm talking about increase in market labor demand versus a shift up in labor supply in the context of market power. And again, I should be clear, I don't want to rule out demand at all, right? Like, you shouldn't interpret this as saying, and that's why I mentioned this point about the standard error. So you can't rule out, once you look at the confidence intervals of each of these channels, you can't rule out a sizable effect. It's just that there's no smoking gun evidence of demand. So absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? So I'm not saying there's no demand, it's just that I don't find the smoking gun evidence.
Okay. Subhashish, and then.
The first, in the beginning you mentioned that this whole initiative has no extra cost on NRGS, but smart card has its costs. That, and the other point is that, from the field experience, that there is always a effect of increasing inequality from infrastructure development, right? So. Most of the NRGS, or a large part of the NRGS, was on the connectivity, rural connectivity. And I saw that the rural connectivity improves wage or the opportunity for all mass, but it proportionately increased the opportunity for the relatively richer rural folks. So, but you are not working with the unit of study is not the individual. Your unit of study is the village, right? So
no, it is the individual, but what I don't have is I don't have data on the non-job card population. So we are sampling individuals from the universe of job card holders, which is 50% of the population.
Yeah, but even with the job card holder, there is a significant number, those who never worked on the job card. So you can try with that. Like, I just want to know that, because it's a really big project, so you want to know the like where actually this effect is concentrating on the income distribution. That would be a fascinating thing to see, actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, so, I went through that very fast. I think I had this table on heterogeneous effects by measures of caste, education, income, and we're not seeing any significant difference there. But I think your question raises an important point, right? See, a lot of people have this belief that NRGS benefits those who work on NRGS. The whole point of this is to say that even in that universe of job card holders, the non-NRGS workers are also benefiting as much, if not more, in terms of the increased market rate. So the reason we don't break it down further by who worked on NRGS versus not is that's a completely endogenous choice, right, of whether you're working on NRGS. So which is why we kind of focus on the overall effect. But the data we have on the distribution, there's two distribution effects. First is that there's first order stochastic dominance in the treatment area. So everybody is better off. So it's not like it's coming at the cost of some. And then within that, there is no heterogeneity in those gains. which is what those heterogeneous effects tables show.
Along the cost and.
Along the cost.
So this is the last question. Right here.
This is totally cool stuff, Karthik. I think the evidences that you present is challenging and interesting. But I want to go back to one point that Debraj raised, which is what information do we have on the effects of people like landlords, their income, their well-being? That seems to me is critical. I prefer to think about these kinds of experiments as fodder for a more structural model where you can think about these kinds of effects. The reason why that structural model may be needed is because if there are any fixed costs associated with improving the land or with setting up enterprises, some ex post monopsony power may well be needed to induce those people to make the necessary investments. And there, I think it's really important. This is, if you forgive me, a sort of macro insight. You need a structural model because evaluating the effects of programs, which as you described, are perceived by the participants explicitly as temporary, to think about, for example, permanent changes in these kinds of programs, that's one of the places that you do need a model. So what do we know more precisely about what happens to the incomes of landlords and so on? The other thing that I found surprising was you thought this stuff was temporary, but the number of establishments goes up 18 months later. That's also kind of intriguing. So it'd be nice to and let me volunteer lots of people to help you develop structural models of this kind of stuff.
No, absolutely. So I think, yeah, so all points well taken. I think the first thing on the landlords is like I was telling Debraj, I wish we had the data, we don't. But my conjecture is almost certainly that the landlords were worse off in the short term, and that's consistent with Ashok's work, right? I mean, they have this line there, right, where they say that in the context of the data in Maharashtra, that the Marathas, they want to, I think it's the earlier paper was called One Kind of Democracy, right, which is how the elements of democracy all work in terms of elections and stuff, but it's the way the local networks work out is that the local elite castes do make sure that they control the Gram Panchayat, and then they have this explicit paragraph that is, it could be the foreshadow to this whole thing. It says they want to do this to thwart the implementation of a program like this because it would push up wages. So I think it's very clear that this was reducing rents of the landlords. Now, what is not obvious is if in the long term the landlords are also better off, because this goes back, if the increased wages gets you to then coordinate on a mechanized equilibrium, that's kind of the Hornbeck-Naidu point, that the wages are so low that the returns to the capital investment is not there, so you almost need that exogenous push, to coordinate on a new mechanized equilibrium. So there's some conjectural evidence that some of this may be going on, but definitely needs more work. I think on macro model, I couldn't agree more, and I think this is now a project that started as one paper, but I think will easily become 3, because this guy has already become 91 pages, and so I think focusing this paper and establishing facts and saying, here's what we can say about mechanisms on labor market GE, I think is kind of a reasonable bound for this paper. But absolutely, I think, we chatted with Dave Lavakos and Tommaso, and they were like, of course you need a macro model, and then we'll do a bunch of stuff. And more generally, I think, there is, I think as scientific progress, economic research becomes more and more specialized, I think there's just more need for complementarity of teams and styles. So, I'm working now with IO economists to do a structural IO demand model of my school choice experiment that we did, because the guys writing all of these models would give an arm and a leg for the kind of exogenous variation we have, and conversely, this can inform, the models can really help, I think, flesh out some of these things. So I couldn't agree more. It's just that I think sometimes with experiments, the problem is you read the experiments and they look deceptively simple because you don't see how much of the effort has gone in up front, right? So it's only when you run them that you realize how much of a full-time job it is. So in terms of kind of pushing the frontier, I think there's just a case for a lot more kind of partnerships across people doing experiments and then different kinds of theoretical work.